Hello, and welcome to the podcast's Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. And for those of you who love our Bible and Beyond podcasts, would you please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page? Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at any level just right for you. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
Well, I'm really pleased to welcome back to the Bible and Beyond podcast a scholar of many interests and talents. This is Dr. James McGrath, who is a Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University in Indianapolis. He's best known for his work on early Christianity and the Mandaeans. In fact, we did a podcast interview about that back in November 2019, I think it was. For today, though, we're going to take a look at some ideas from James's new and forthcoming book titled From A to Z of the New Testament. It introduces the ABCs of New Testament studies, but it also covers some topics of special interest to our Bible and Beyond audience. What I want to ask you, James, is how the cousins of the Bible help us to understand the Bible itself. So I'm referring to those books that are closely related to the books in the Bible, but not included in the Protestant or Catholic Bibles. So welcome back. We'll have fun with this conversation as we have in the past.
Yeah, it's always great talking to you, Shirley. Thank you so much. This is a delight to have a chance to talk about the forthcoming book, but I enjoy talking with you about anything. We have so many interests shared in common. And since you mentioned the Mandaeans, that's one thing that's perhaps worth starting with. I've just basically finished a year of sabbatical working on book projects related to, so not the A to Z of the New Testament is done, was finished last summer and is forthcoming in October.
Okay.
But I've written books, one for general audience and one scholarly monograph about John the Baptist. And what we know about John the Baptist isn't limited to the New Testament, right? And so if we want to understand him, then we need to bring in the Jewish historian Josephus. I argue in the book that contrary to what seems to be the consensus view nowadays, or the sort of status quo, I'd rather say, the Mandaean sources are relevant, not just to how people in later times and today think about John, but to trying to triangulate on the historical John, right? These are texts that were transmitted through a tradition that was not Christian, but ultimately derived something from John the Baptist and still holds him in high esteem. And so those seem like a good place to start since they're fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
But the truth is that we have references to pagan poets, right? Acts 17, right? The Areopagus speech. As your own poets have said. We have Jude quoting First Enoch, and so I like to say that no canon is hermetically sealed, right? It always quotes from, reflects knowledge of, alludes to things that are outside. And of course, I'll make a pun that only a few people in the world probably would get, but most of them probably also listen to your podcast, which is that, when I say that no canon is hermetically sealed, of course, there is the Hermetic literature, which is one area that sometimes is brought into the discussion of Gnosticism and the New Testament. Is a terrible pun that appreciate, and the rest will shake their heads.
You're pointing out the idea of a hermetically sealed canon. Since there are a lot of people who feel like the Bible is complete as it is, and the Bible says in Revelation that it is complete, don't add anything to it. Why do you think we should know these other things? I mean, is there something about these other things that we need to know, or is it just something that would be helpful? Or what do you think about that?
I mean, I think it varies from case to case, right? In some cases, it just adds something helpful, right? It's fills in more of our understanding, but we would have figured it out more or less without it. In other cases, it can be crucial.
Okay.
When we encounter the phrase "Son of Man" in the Gospels, it sounds like a title, right? The way it's rendered. Of course, we're getting it in English via Greek, but it reflects an Aramaic phrase that wasn't a title. It was an everyday expression that means someone, a human being. And unless we have that linguistic context, then understanding even some of the things that are within the canon, like the Book of Daniel and how it's using it, understanding the similitudes of Enoch, which, if you are part of the Ethiopian church, is in your canon. Right? So the fact that canons have differed historically is also important to this. Understanding that the Book of Revelation shouldn't get the last word on canon when it barely made it in. Right? There's this long history, which again is not so much other literature from around the same time as the history of reception of this work. Right? But that too is something outside the canon that's relevant to understanding it.
What do you mean by the history of reception? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Book of Revelation struggled for acceptance. It made it into the canon of the Eastern churches so late that it's not part of, no part of it appears within the liturgy. And that in itself is interesting. And then not long after that, right, we fast forward a few centuries and we're at the Protestant Reformation when Luther's saying, I'll include this because everybody seems to want it in here, but here are my misgivings. And so the reactions to it have varied. And so treating it as though you stick it on the end of your Bible and then suddenly it's allowed to have the last word. If you don't know the history of how that canon came about, you won't realize that there were arguments about whether that book should even be in there. And that's what I mean by the history of reception, how people have responded to these works, the debates that happened about what should be in and what shouldn't be. If we're to understand these texts on their own terms, sometimes we need to actually treat them as things that are not part of a canon, because when they were first written, they weren't.
Huh.
And then if we want to understand what they should mean for us today, then any answer to that has to include not just, oh, they're part of the Bible, but how did this Bible come about? Why doesn't everybody have the same Bible? And what's the relevance of those things that we started off talking about, those things that were excluded, sometimes because people didn't like them, but sometimes simply because they were written a little bit later, or they're from a slightly different tradition or something else.
So you're right. The word canon just sort of has a magic to it. Like this is a God-given box or somehow that I think you're helping us sort of challenge that question a bit. But maybe in that same vein, you could talk to us a little bit about what the word apocrypha means. Like apocrypha seems like it's related to the Bible, but outside that magic box. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good thing. And do you know, so I don't know whether you and your listeners know, I'll hold this up to the screen, but I actually, first day of class, my students come in and they're all enthusiastic, going to get a course about the Bible.
Yes.
Second day, have to talk about how do these books end up in a collection together.
Yes.
And worst case scenario, I give a boring history lesson, telling them about the Council of Trent and the Council of Jamnia and other things that they are not yet interested in.
Yes.
And I rob them of all their enthusiasm. And so I actually developed a card game called Canon to try and teach this inductively. And the main point is, to translate the dynamics of how a canon comes about into game mechanics.
Yeah.
Because in the very act of doing that and having the debates, you realize this is a messy process.
Okay.
And that I think is important. And so I actually have decks, that are sort of dedicated to or include works that are known as apocryphal works.
Okay.
And that word has two different meanings in relation to the Bible. Sometimes you'll hear the Old Testament Apocrypha, or sometimes called the Deuterocanonical works, which are works that were part of the Greek collection of the Jewish scriptures, but not in what became the Hebrew Bible and the canon of Judaism as it formed. And so at the time of the Protestant Reformation, Protestants, for the most part, decided those works will not be part of our Old Testament. And so that's why Catholic and Orthodox churches have a larger Old Testament canon than Protestants do. But then you'll also hear about New Testament Apocrypha. And what that means is other works, usually their apocryphal is being used in the sense of, really what they really mean is pseudepigrapha, right? Things that are written in somebody else's name, things that are not by who they claim to be. And of course, New Testament scholars will say, well, neither is some of the stuff that's in the New Testament. Thank you very much. But and there too, in the Christian tradition, right, we have lots of stories about, for instance, to reconnect with my recent book project, findings of the head of John the Baptist,
Yeah.
but also, how Thomas ends up going to India, and Thecla, and how Paul doesn't want to accept her, but she takes matters into her own hands and does all these heroic things. And, all of those stories, things that sometimes are about the same time period and the same characters as are in the New Testament. Sometimes are just about barely related, and they feature in sort of bit parts. But all of that stuff is there, and shows that throughout most of Christian history, even those who had a canon felt it was worth telling stories around the edges and in between the seams of the canon.
So you mentioned it parenthetically a moment ago about the pseudepigrapha, which is a word that people don't use all the time. Could you slow down a little bit and tell us what that word means and how that also works in the Bible and outside the Bible? What is that word?
Yeah, right.
Help us with that.
So pseudo is a prefix, right? It comes from Greek that means fake or false, and epigraphy, graphe, things that have to do with people may recognize some words they know, graphic arts, things like that have to do with writing, and so falsely written in somebody else's name. That's itself a wide category, can include people writing under a pen name, but for the most part, in relation to biblical texts and related extra biblical texts, what it means is things that were written pretending to be by someone that didn't write them. And we have some of those within the Bible, but we also have a whole lot more just in sheer volume outside of the Bible.
So is it a good thing or a bad thing when people write with somebody else's name in the Bible?
That really depends who you ask.
Okay.
Some people may have seen the recent news that there was an author who found just by accident that somebody had a whole bunch of AI generated pieces of literature, supposedly by this famous author, but not actually by them. And just as an anecdote, she was not happy, right?
Yeah.
And if somebody produced some things, claimed they were by me, and put them on, selling them on Amazon, I would not be happy.
Yeah.
And so, contrary to what you sometimes hear, I think Bart Ehrman has made a very good case that most ancient authors didn't like someone writing in their name. And so that's one type of pseudepigraphy, which I think is was problematic then as it is now. But then there are also instances of people writing in the name of some past person, and I think that often was motivated by other things rather than pure deception.
Okay.
And when it was motivated by deception, it was potentially with positive motives, right?
Okay.
In the book of Daniel, right, we have this crisis going on. People are struggling to make sense of it, and some figure from the past speaking authoritatively to this moment will help them see this crisis through and help them. And it seems to have worked and seems to have been persuasive. The author of the letter of Jude in the New Testament seems to have believed, unlike almost anybody you ask, scholar or not, that the Book of Enoch was written by Enoch. And so whether that's a good thing or not is a matter of much debate, shall we say.
Right.
But I think what's crucial is that oftentimes, this, what I call the postcard of Jude, because it's so small, right, stuck there, doesn't even get read today.
Yeah.
Never mind things outside the New Testament. Some people have these things that are quirky. They're not sure what to do with them in the New Testament that they mostly ignore. And paying attention to the details of those works, noticing when they explicitly refer to things outside of the canon, that in itself, I think, opens avenues of exploration about what a canon is, what these texts within the canon are, that a lot of people miss, even as readers of the New Testament.
Great. Well, then let's use that as an example. Then probably most people don't know Enoch. What is Enoch and who is he and what is the book about?
Right. So we have multiple books of Enoch, but when somebody refers to the Book of Enoch in the singular, they often mean the original, which itself seems to have been a composite work that grew over time. And Enoch is a figure who's mentioned in the book of Genesis very briefly. Right?
Yeah.
And clearly, one thing would-be authors should learn from the book of Genesis is if you want to create a huge array of, have people become fans of your work and create a huge array of fan fiction about what you've written. Just give this passing reference, right? Like, he walked with God, and then he wasn't because God took him. It's like, that's not a lot to go on, right?
No,
And
you're right.
a whole book that talks about, well, what happened? Well, he got taken up to heaven, and he got to, all these celestial mysteries revealed to him and things of that sort. And it's within that book that we get some of the backstory of something that doesn't really appear in the Hebrew Bible, but is all over the New Testament, the notion of demons or unclean spirits. Right? The idea that there were these offspring of celestial beings and humans who were sort of half angelic or half divine, half human, and their bodies perish in the flood, but their spirits live on. And they don't like being without bodies, and so they start getting into other people's bodies, and you get this whole idea of demons and things. And there too, I think there's a lot that's part of the world of exorcism, which exorcism itself is not very familiar to most people in the present day.
Right.
But even if it is, as a part of, let's say, the Catholic tradition or something like that, it's still not with the Enochic tradition and all these stories that you have in some of the ancient works. And so here too, there's a lot that's assumed about the world, the way the world works. Spiritual beings that are present and can cause good or harm that modern people will not know about or will not bring to their reading of the canonical works or extra canonical works without reading some of this literature that's definitely some of the literature that's not in the canon.
You're making a really good point here, I think, that we can relate to in terms of the way we read the New Testament. And we think we read it over and over again. We think we know what it's talking about. But when you zero down into it and you think, I actually don't know what that word means. Like when we're talking about exorcism, we translate it into the way we think it makes sense to us now. But actually, do I know what it meant then? Probably not. So that's a very helpful example for us.
Yeah. And I think anytime we assume that we know what it means because we use the same word today and it means the same thing,
we're in trouble.
We should probably be very, very cautious because those are the ones that really catch us, right? Sometimes there's something in there and we're puzzled, right? Right off the bat. We have no idea what this person is trying to say. And those ones oftentimes we're okay, right? We struggle to make sense of it, or we say, I don't know, right? It's where we think we understand because, it sounds like something that makes sense today, that we're most likely to just fall into a pitfall of not being aware of cultural difference or something like that.
You also make the point in your book that I think is so helpful for us to think about the way understanding some books outside the canon help us understand the history of what was going on in the Bible too. And you use the books of the Maccabees for that example. Can you tell us about the Maccabees and how that helps with history?
Sure. So again, there's a lot that could be said about the Maccabees. The books of the Maccabees are about events that are probably also the backdrop I was alluding to the Book of Daniel.
Okay.
And the Book of Daniel is in Jewish and all Christian Bibles. The books of the Maccabees are in Catholic and Orthodox Christian Bibles, but not in Jewish or Protestant Christian Bibles. Whether it's in your canon or not, these events really shape the New Testament world in a lot of ways. Right? Why do things like circumcision, and keeping kosher, observing the food laws, and observing the Sabbath become sort of emblems of being, part of God's people, which then Paul is seeking to address when he says that God is accepting people without circumcision and allowing them to be part of Abraham's family. Well, what Paul is treading on there, the minefield that he's wandering into, and he knows he's getting into it, and he's doing so deliberately, is one that was created by persecution by a Syrian ruler who outlawed observance of the Jewish law. And we could talk about what might have been the reasons why he would have done that. But long story short, he did so. He rededicated the temple in Jerusalem to sort of a generic idea of the high god, right? So Baal Shomem, Baal or Lord of Heaven, Zeus Olympus in Greek, sacrificed a pig. All of this anathema to conservative Jews. And even I think some of the liberal ones who were in that era, such as they were, probably were like, this may be just going a little bit too far even for us. Be that as it may, this created, there was a backlash, there was an uprising, there was resistance that arose, and the family that became leaders of that resistance, are often referred to as the Maccabees. Once they become the high priests and then the kings in Judah and Israel, then they become known as the Hasmoneans, and that's an important name to know, is sort of in terms of their dynasty. And they rule up until the last of them is eliminated with the family of Herod the Great, right? Herod's father. There's some intrigue, and that's how we get the Herodians ruling in the time of Jesus. And so this is recent history. This is history within living memory for probably some people in this time period. And so, having had the Jewish law outlawed, of course, these things become, the badges of, those who are faithfully observing, right? Because loving your neighbor is also in the law, but nobody singled you out for persecution or execution because you loved your neighbor, right? It was doing the things that were distinctive of the Jewish law, like circumcising your children. And so, because those things could cost you your life or your freedom, they became emblems of obedience. And what Paul is really arguing against is making those things definitive in a way that places the emphasis there rather than on things like loving your neighbor or other things that historically, right, all of ancient Israel's prophets would have said, practicing justice and all those things are what matters most. Right? And so this was not an argument against Judaism or something like that, as it's often been seen, right, by Christians reading it from their perspective. It is somebody with one aspect of Jewish tradition arguing against another viewpoint that has come to predominate in other strands of their tradition. And when we understand that background, which we'll only understand if, again, we read the history, and that's in books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, then I think you'll agree that we can see resonances with the kinds of issues that not just Jews, not just Christians, but whole societies and the world wrestles with today, about how we define our identity as peoples, as nations, as religious communities, as whatever. And so it helps us understand the relevance of these texts all the more when we inform ourselves about this history, right? So even if it's not in your canon, you can read it for informational purposes.
That's really interesting to think about the way to read the text with the food laws, for example, in a different way. Also, the Maccabees bring up the subject of martyrdom, don't they? Isn't that another issue that comes into the New Testament? How does that work?
Yes. So I think the books of the Maccabees, and maybe one of the very latest, it's not clear when it's written in relation to some of the New Testament works, but what's known as 4th Maccabees, right? There are a lot of books of these. This was a period of that people were interested in telling the story of.
Yeah.
But 4th Maccabees is interesting because it's a story about sort of Jewish resistance to these sort of Hellenistic forces and things like that are persecuting them, and yet it's presenting the Jewish martyrs in terms of this Hellenistic ideal of courageous, unflinching willingness to give your life for what is right and things like that. And so we have the development of essentially a martyr theology, right? So in 4th Maccabees, one of the Jewish martyrs who is dying prays that his life will essentially be acceptable as a sacrifice and turn God's wrath away from the people. Because how do you explain that the people are going through this kind of calamity in the first place? Well, God is angry, and so hoping that martyrdom will turn away God's wrath. Well, we can see that provides a framework for followers of John the Baptist, I'll throw in there as well, and Jesus to try to make sense of the deaths of these individuals that they expected to finally be the ones that heroically sort of vanquish and overcome and do things like that, and yet they don't do what at least some people were expecting or hoping.
Okay, and then there are other little sort of almost sidebar issues that come up too when we get into these other texts. Like you had mentioned, for example, that one of the terms that caught my attention was the term Gehenna, which is often translated as hell. But where does that idea even come from? Is that an extra canonical kind of word, or where did it come from?
Yeah, that's a good example of thinking about things that are outside of the canon, right? Because lots of people who are just believe the Bible alone, stuff like that, will have heard things in sermons that
Yeah.
will say, oh, well, Gehenna was, where they burned their rubbish, their trash outside of Jerusalem. Or it was significant because it was a place where they practiced child sacrifice or whatever. And in all of those cases, they're bringing in not just some things that are mentioned in the Bible, right? There are a few places where the place is mentioned, but Gehenna simply comes from like the Hebrew and Aramaic words for the Hinnom Valley, right? That valley that runs alongside the city of Jerusalem. And why this becomes a word for like a place of, sort of a place that one goes in the afterlife is
bad
not
place.
entirely clear, right? It clearly does become that, right? And by the time we get into like later rabbinic tradition, it's being used in a way that seems to indicate that. And figuring out exactly when that happens can be crucial, right? Because is it you're going to be dead and cease to exist, with your bones lying in this valley, or is it you're going to be in the underworld suffering post-mortem torment, right? And as words transition, often it's hard to know, we have to figure out exactly where we are in the development of the term in order to know how it's being used. I mean, the word used a few minutes ago, martyr, right, that we were talking about, starts out as, from a Greek word that means witness. And so in the New Testament, when it talks about such and such, my faithful witness, is that somebody who gave their life because they were the witness, faithful to Jesus unto death? Or does it not mean that yet, right? And so illustrates not just how information, discussions, traditions outside of the text may be relevant to making sense of a term, but dictionaries and things like that are crucial. And then recognizing that words evolve. And so just looking at a dictionary doesn't tell you what it meant in this particular time. And so recognizing that linguistics and other things are relevant to making sense of the Bible, I think is every bit as important in some ways as recognizing that other literature is crucial.
So we've gone from literature to history and terminology, and I think it might be helpful for us to circle back to the point you were making in First Enoch about angels and fallen angels. What do those words? I mean, we think of angels as flying around with wings or ideas that come to us, like in the New Testament. But what do they mean back then? I mean, let's talk about the meaning of the words.
Oh, I think, I mean, part of me wants to say, let's just do a separate thing sometime on angels because there's just so much.
Yeah.
But in short, right, to the extent that one could be short on a huge topic, the celestial realm, even within this first century framework that some would say was at least moving in the direction of monotheism, right? Whether it was monotheistic in the sense of belief in one God, the term gods is used in the plural. You find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was not controversial to do so. And what was important in Judaism, what was definitive, was that there was one God who was supreme, right, who was ultimately in control and sovereign, and who was alone worthy of worship. And so you didn't offer sacrifice and most other forms of worship to anyone else. Apart from that, the celestial realm was a hive of activity. Right? It was hustling and bustling. And really what people thought of was that there's a celestial bureaucracy, right? So you have angels that are responsible, right? People don't know about, planets moving via gravitational, forces and, through natural processes and all these kinds of scientific ideas. The heavens move, right? And there's the idea that there are multiple heavens around the earth. And all of that involves angelic activity, and all of these celestial realms are populated by angels, and weather and sickness and healing and all of those things are attributed to celestial actions, but often not direct action by the one supreme God, but by figures who are closer and who are directly responsible for these things. And that's why I like to call it a celestial bureaucracy. Right?
Yeah.
I will confess this won't help anybody figure out exactly where I live in Indianapolis, but there's this really, really pothole-filled street that connects with my street. I'll say it's not my street, it connects with it, but it is one of the most convenient ways of getting here, to the chagrin of many. And if I want to get that fixed, I don't call the president of the United States, right?
Right.
There's somebody local who is directly responsible, right? Even if I call the president, he would have to call somebody who would call somebody who would. And so even for those who prayed to the one God and thought that was the appropriate mode of prayer, and that wasn't the universal view, but certainly many viewed that as the way.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, God then designates someone to deal with things. And so that's why you have amulets, and you have incantation bowls, you have other things that people use, basically trying to get these directly responsible functionaries to act in a more direct way, shall we say.
Well, I never thought about why I would want to have a lesser God, but you're right. You need to have somebody local to take care of the little details. Very helpful. So I have so many more questions I want to ask you, and I don't know how you could do each one without another whole podcast. Maybe we'll have to have you come back and do it again. But I'd love to know more about the race of the giants, the Nephilim, and more about the Essenes and how they connect. There's so many interesting topics you bring up in your book. So I guess the best thing I can do is encourage people to see your new book. Tell us the title again and when we can find it.
Yeah, so it's the A to Z of the New Testament. And I keep telling people, if you live in the UK, on the cover it will say the A to Z of the New Testament. It translates automatically, and so
all right, that sounds just great.
It's coming out with from Erdman's. It'll be out October 2023. And despite us having really jumped into some of the really detailed nitty-gritty stuff, what it tries to do is take some of this kind of information, but meander through it, like starting with a text that's a bit puzzling, and then ask, well, how might we figure out what this means? And then bringing in, something from outside, and doing that in an inductive and a slow and sort of gentle way. Because I think, well, lots of the people who listen to your podcast are the kinds of people that actually read New Testament scholarship and are interested in the stuff they write.
Yeah.
There's a big disconnect, right? And there are loads of people who go their whole lives in churches without ever finding out what scholars say about these texts.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an effort to try to make the things that we know and take for granted in my field, and make those things accessible, easily accessible, and enjoyable to read about for a general audience. And we'll see whether I've succeeded, but that at least was my aim.
Well, I think it's a terrific book. I've had a chance to look at it, and I have to say it is easy to read. It's compelling, and I hope people really dig into it, because I would like for people to know the Bible better. So I think you've done a great job opening up that door for people, James. It's so much fun to talk to you. We better say goodbye until next time.
Yeah, well, I'm already looking forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much.
I will too, James. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode from the show notes on the website, earlychristiantexts.com. Or just come browse around on the website to find all the other resources provided for you there. Also, we ask for your support to keep producing these podcast interviews. Please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page at patreon.com/BibleandBeyond. And we love hearing from you on the Facebook page at Early Christian Texts or Twitter at EarlyXIAN Texts. Be sure to come back next month for our next episode on Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond.